The world woke up on an ordinary Tuesday. Nothing unusual. Nothing to suggest that the laws of physics were about to break down in the most spectacularly catastrophic way possible. But that's how it always starts, doesn't it? With the kind of normalcy that tricks you into believing you have control, until you don't. Dr. Simon Porter sat in the front row of a sterile, gray auditorium, nervously adjusting his glasses and watching a row of skeptics file in for his big moment. His lab coat, dotted with a coffee stain from breakfast, clung awkwardly to his lanky frame. He was sweating, though he would never admit it. He had spent years on this theory, his most ridiculous one yet, and now it was time to present it to the world. Or, at least, to a few dozen physicists who had already decided he was crazy before he even opened his mouth. Simon wasn't fazed by their skepticism. He had made a career out of proposing the unthinkable, and most of the time, they called him a genius. It was just the other times that had his heart racing. The last time he'd dared to suggest that the universe might not be entirely composed of what they thought, he had been met with silence, followed by the polite but unmistakable hum of doubt. But today? Today was different. His PowerPoint presentation flashed on the screen. It read, "The Quantum Virus, a new paradigm of time manipulation." The room fell silent. He could almost hear their collective groan. The usual set of furrowed brows and judgmental sighs. But Simon didn't flinch. He stood up, cleared his throat, and flashed his brightest, most confident grin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I know what you're thinking. Here comes Simon Porter with his crazy ideas again. But bear with me. This one is big." He gestured toward the screen. A simple diagram of atoms surrounded by concentric rings appeared. "I propose that there is a virus unlike any other, not made of bacteria or DNA, but of quantum information. It infects the fundamental structure of matter itself. It's a virus that doesn't just invade your body, it invades reality. It rewrites the very laws of physics." The audience exchanged confused looks. "A virus that can change the quantum state of atoms. A virus that could hypothetically make a solid object turn into a gas, or turn light into darkness." Simon paused for dramatic effect. "And here's the kicker, it's not from this time." He let that hang in the air for a moment, letting the words sink in. "It's from the future." A nervous chuckle rippled through the room, followed by a few awkward coughs. Simon didn't flinch. Instead, he pressed on, undeterred. "It's a virus that comes from tomorrow, one that has learned how to manipulate the quantum field, how to alter time itself. It's a virus that, when introduced into the timeline, begins to destabilize everything. From particles to people, to the very fabric of reality." He clicked the remote, and the screen showed a flash of light that resembled a temporal storm, spiraling out of control, and once it's unleashed, it becomes a self-perpetuating anomaly. A virus, yes, but also a weapon. One that's capable of rewriting history. The room went completely silent. The physicists exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others looking at Simon with something approaching pity. Simon ignored them and kept going. "The storm you're seeing here is just the beginning. It starts with one infected particle, and then, boom. It spreads. And when it infects people, it doesn't just make them sick. No, it rewrites their quantum signature. You could be standing next to your best friend, and suddenly," he snapped his fingers, "you're in a different timeline. A timeline where your friend has become your enemy. Where gravity doesn't exist. Where light is bent in ways you can't even begin to understand." "Right," one physicist muttered, arms crossed. "And I suppose you've discovered this virus yourself, Professor Porter?" Simon didn't miss a beat. "Not yet. But I've seen the signs. We're already seeing small tremors. Unexplainable glitches. A ripple in the quantum field. Things like, I don't know, cars freezing in mid-motion, birds flying backward, people caught in loops of time. Just wait. It's coming." The lights flickered. The projector sputtered. The hum of electricity in the building faltered, and for a brief second, it seemed like Simon's insanity had reached its peak. But then something strange happened. Something very, very strange. The room's temperature dropped. Just a few degrees at first. Not enough to make people uncomfortable, but enough to notice. And then, as Simon clicked through the slides, something far worse happened. The screen went black. There was a flicker of static. Then bang! A deep rumble shook the walls, and the lights went out completely. The projector screen was still blank, but the air hummed with energy. The ceiling seemed to groan, as if the building itself were preparing for something much, much bigger. Someone screamed. Then another. And then chaos. From the back of the room, a voice shouted, "What the hell is happening?" Simon stood frozen, his eyes wide, a mixture of fear and excitement racing through him. This was it. This was exactly what he had warned them about. The quantum virus, whatever it was, had just entered the building. Okay, he said to himself, taking a deep breath. It's happening. It's real. People were shouting, scrambling toward the exits, but as they did, something stranger occurred. Their movements slowed. The air seemed to thicken, like someone had hit the pause button on reality. Simon turned, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't just a power outage. It wasn't a mere glitch. The entire structure of reality had begun to collapse. As Simon made his way toward the door, a young woman, a fellow physicist named Margot Rojas, caught up to him. She was breathing heavily, eyes wide with panic, but there was something else there too. Something like recognition. Like she had always known this was coming. "What's happening, Simon?" Margot asked, grabbing his arm. "Tell me what you know." Simon blinked, his mind racing. "It's the virus," he said. "The quantum virus. It's not just infecting people, it's infecting time itself. I've seen it before in theory, but now it's real. It's destabilizing everything." Margot's eyes widened. "The future?" "Exactly," Simon said. "It's not just a virus. It's a weapon. And the future wants to rewrite history." The lights flickered again, a maddening stutter of electricity as though the building itself were having a nervous breakdown. Simon felt the air shift thicker now, charged with static, and his breath came in shallow gasps. His eyes darted around the room, watching as people scrambled toward the exits. But something wasn't right. The walls didn't just feel like they were closing in, they were closing in. Margot grabbed his arm tighter, her fingers cold and frantic. "Simon, you need to explain more. What the hell are we dealing with here?" Simon's throat was dry, and his mind raced to catch up with what was happening. The storm outside was no longer just a theory, it was real, and it was inside them. He could feel it. The air warped around them, shimmering in unnatural ways, like the distortion of a heat mirage, but colder. The quantum virus had begun its true work, and the laws of physics were now optional. I don't know," he said, forcing the words out. "I mean, I know it's not supposed to happen like this. But it's starting. The virus. It's not just infecting people. It's infecting reality itself." He looked around at the chaos, his mind moving at breakneck speed. The quantum state, it's unstable. It's like the whole room is being rewritten. A low hum began vibrating through the air, almost imperceptible at first, but then it grew stronger, rattling Simon's bones. It was a sound he couldn't place, a hum of some kind of unseen energy, far more terrifying than any sound he had ever heard. And then at once everything around them froze. People in the aisles stopped mid-step, their feet still in the air as if suspended by invisible threads. A man in the front row, halfway to his feet, hovered in place. Margot's hand was still gripping Simon's arm, but the pressure was gone, as if the molecules that connected them had temporarily ceased to exist. Simon blinked, trying to comprehend what was happening. The time virus wasn't just altering things, it was stopping them. The virus was reaching into the very core of existence, tweaking and pulling at the delicate balance of time itself. Are we in some kind of time loop? Margot's voice broke through the stillness, but her words sounded muffled, like the air had thickened, solidified. Simon shook his head, his mind racing through the possibilities. A time loop wouldn't cause this kind of freeze. This wasn't time moving in circles, this was time fracturing. It was as if the virus was rewriting the timeline, shifting the events so rapidly that reality couldn't keep up. Like a film reel being torn apart. He looked down at the ground. There was something strange about the floor beneath them. The edges of the tiles rippled, bent as if the very structure of the room had lost its integrity. The air felt like it was being pulled and twisted by invisible forces. Simon instinctively reached out to Margot, pulling her toward him. "Don't touch anything," he said, his voice cracking. "Whatever happens, we can't let this place break apart. It'll pull us into the fracture." Margot nodded, wide-eyed, her breath visible now, too. The temperature had dropped again, the air now bitterly cold, biting at their skin. Simon knew they were in more than just physical danger. They were in the very heart of the anomaly, where time and space collided. Before he could process the next thought, the world jerked. One moment, they were standing in the auditorium, and the next there was a split second of pure white light. The ground shifted beneath them, and they were no longer in the same place. Simon blinked hard, trying to adjust his vision. They were still in the same room, or what looked like the same room, but everything was wrong. The layout had changed. The walls were a shade darker, the doorways misaligned. The room was both familiar and unfamiliar at once, like stepping into a nightmare version of reality. And the people, well, some of them were still frozen, but others had disappeared altogether, as if they'd never been there in the first place. What the hell just happened? Margot whispered, her voice trembling as she took in the new surroundings. I don't know," Simon stammered. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he couldn't help but feel a sick thrill coursing through him. This wasn't a glitch, this was a breach. A tear in the fabric of time. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Or what used to be the clock. It was running backward, its hands spinning in wild, erratic circles, moving faster than he could track. The numbers blurred into each other, like a melting painting. "That's impossible," Simon said, more to himself than to Margot. "It's not impossible," Margot replied quietly. "It's happening. The virus, it's rewriting time, rewriting reality." "We need to get out of here," Simon said, his voice suddenly urgent. "We need to find a way to stop this before it spreads further. The virus, it's got to be using this building as a testing ground." Or, another pulse of energy hit, this one harder, stronger. The air shimmered again, and Simon felt his stomach churn. He staggered slightly, his head pounding from the sudden dizziness. "Simon?" Margot's voice was sharp with concern. "Are you all right?" He shook his head. "I don't know how much longer we've got." But it was too late. The walls of the room seemed to split apart, as though reality itself was folding in on itself. Objects in the room, papers, books, glass, twisted and distorted, hovering for a split second in midair before suddenly freezing. The temperature dropped further, and Simon's breath came out in thick, foggy clouds. Then, without warning, the entire building shifted again, and they were standing on the outside of the auditorium. Though the world outside was no longer the one they knew, the sky was wrong, too dark, too still, as though the sun had been swallowed by an unseen force. The city skyline, once familiar, was now an alien landscape, twisted and contorted, buildings that shouldn't have been there standing where they had never been before. The streets were empty, but Simon could hear faint whispers, echoes of other timelines. Simon's mind was reeling. They were no longer in their own time, we're in a different version of the world, Margot said, her voice barely audible over the noise in Simon's head. This is what happens when reality fractures." Simon swallowed hard, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. "This isn't just one timeline. It's multiple. The virus is bleeding through. It's pulling us through different moments in time. This is warping the world itself." And if we can't stop it, Margot trailed off, her gaze fixed on the twisted horizon. Then it's only going to get worse. Before Simon could respond, something shifted in the distance. Figures began to emerge from the shadows of the distorted city. They weren't human, not in the way he knew humans to be. Their outlines flickered in and out of existence, like holograms struggling to maintain form. Some were tall, others small, but all of them had one thing in common: they were changing. As if they were unfinished. Simon's heart raced. They weren't just anomalies. They were agents of the virus. Margot grabbed Simon's arm. We need to get to the source of this, Simon. We have to find the chrono key before it spreads any further. Simon nodded. I know. But we're not alone anymore. And in that moment, Simon realized, the future wasn't just reaching back to alter the past. It was coming for them. Simon felt the pulse of energy before he saw it, the electric thrum that seemed to emanate from the very air around them, vibrating through his bones like an approaching storm. He turned to Margot, his eyes wide with realization. We're not just out of sync with time, he muttered, the words barely leaving his lips as the figures in the distance began to coalesce, their shapes flickering like shadows caught in a broken mirror. This is something worse. We're in a different version of time altogether. Margot's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on his arm as they backed into the shadow of the twisted building. Her voice was steady but urgent. It's not just the city, Simon. It's the whole world. The virus isn't just rewriting history, it's erasing timelines. Multiple realities are bleeding into each other. Simon nodded, his heart racing. There was no more time to waste. The people know, the shapes moving toward them were no longer human. They flickered in and out of existence, their forms unstable, as if reality itself didn't quite know how to hold them together. Some of them were tall, impossibly tall, while others were bent, hunched like strange versions of what humans could be. They weren't moving with the same rules of physics anymore. They floated, their feet not quite touching the ground, their bodies warping and stretching. We need to get to the chrono key, Margot said, her voice cutting through Simon's spiraling thoughts. Before they do. Simon blinked, realizing she was right. The chrono key, the only device that could stabilize the collapse of timelines, was still their only hope. But the path was unclear. The city around them was constantly shifting. Streets bent back on themselves, buildings melted and reformed, like something out of a fever dream. There was no certainty here, no gravity, no truth to hold on to. He glanced at the ground, which now seemed to pulse with its own strange rhythm. The cracks in the pavement were shifting, the air above them wavering in heatless waves. He could almost see the fractures in reality where time itself had snapped apart, creating cracks that rippled through the world like broken glass. Simon swallowed, pushing away the panic clawing at his chest. We have to find the source. The virus is coming from somewhere. We need to go there. Before Margot could reply, one of the flickering figures stepped forward, its form jagged and incomplete, as if the laws of nature couldn't quite decide whether it was real. It moved toward them with a speed that shouldn't have been possible, bending space as it moved. Get down, Simon hissed, pulling Margot behind the shattered remains of what used to be a storefront. His breath came in short gasps as he peered around the corner, his eyes fixed on the figure. The creature, if it could still be called that, was an impossible blend of shapes and shadows, its outline shifting like smoke caught in the wind. It stopped, pausing for a moment, then glitched, its features flickering, only to stabilize into a form that resembled Simon. Margot's eyes widened. Is that? Simon nodded, his heart racing. It was him, or at least, it looked like him. His face was distorted, like something out of a nightmare, his skin stretched too thin, his eyes too wide. He wasn't human. Not anymore. He was something else. Something wrong. Do you think it's one of them? Margot whispered, not daring to speak louder, her voice laced with a quiet dread. Simon didn't answer. He didn't have to. He could already feel the chill creeping down his spine, the very essence of time trembling around him. This wasn't just a future version of himself. This was a corruption of time. A shattered remnant of who he was supposed to be, a ghost left behind in a timeline that shouldn't exist. The creature seemed to sense their presence. It jerked its head toward their hiding spot, the movement sharp and unnatural, like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Its eyes locked with Simon's, and for a split second, everything around them seemed to collapse in on itself. The world blurred, fragments of past, present, and future collided in a dizzying whirl, pulling Simon into the heart of the storm, his breath caught in his throat. The figure, or whatever it was, spoke, its voice low and distorted, like 1,000 versions of itself overlapping. "You can't fix what's broken," it rasped, its mouth moving unnaturally. "This timeline is already gone. There's nothing left to save." Simon recoiled, his heart pounding. "What are you?" The creature's eyes flickered. Simon's eyes, and the twisted version of himself seemed to smile, though the expression was more of a rictus than anything resembling a human gesture. "I am what happens when time stops caring. I am a fracture. A tear in the flow. Just like you." The words cut through Simon like a knife. He could feel the weight of them like an anchor dragging him down into an endless chasm. He knew it. This was him. Or something that had once been him. A future version, twisted and broken by the virus. "Get out of here!" Margot shouted, grabbing Simon's arm and pulling him back as the creature lunged. Its movements were like liquid, sliding through space, stretching and compressing like a malformed ghost. It reached for Simon, and just as its hand brushed his shoulder, everything jerked again. For a brief, blinding moment, the world cracked open, splitting and realigning in an instant, and Simon felt himself being pulled through time. The ground beneath his feet disappeared, the air turned to static, and the world fragmented into chaos. They were falling through the timeline. When Simon's feet hit solid ground again, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The chaotic hum of distorted reality had stopped. The twisted shapes, the glitching anomalies, were gone. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Too normal. He blinked in confusion, his surroundings unfamiliar but strangely familiar. They were standing in a lab. The sterile, white walls, the rows of glass cases, the cold, efficient machines. But this wasn't their lab. It couldn't be. "Where are we?" Margot whispered, her voice strained, as she looked around. Simon's stomach dropped as he realized where they were. The future. The sterile gleam of the lab, the high-tech equipment, the precision. This was the future's timeline, the one that had already won. "No," Simon breathed, stepping forward. He saw a figure in the distance, someone at a desk, facing away from them, surrounded by glowing screens and glowing monitors. The person turned. It was him. It wasn't just his twisted, broken self from the other timeline. This was a fully intact, future Simon Porter. The Simon who had become the architect of this reality. The one who had corrupted time. The one who had unleashed the virus. "Welcome to the end," the future Simon said, his voice cold and detached. "It was always going to end this way, you know. The future never cared about the past. But now? Now we can fix it." Simon stepped back, his mind racing. "No. This is wrong." The future Simon smiled, his eyes empty, devoid of the spark that made Simon who he was. "Wrong? No, no, no. It's right. Time is broken, and I'm the only one who can fix it. You should have joined me. You should have let me rewrite everything." Simon's world went dark as the last shred of hope slipped away, but as his heart clenched in his chest, one thought echoed in his mind: that he wasn't finished yet.